So we are in Matthew chapter 6, and if you will look there. This past week, we were up in Fresno at the IRS office. I'd never been to the IRS office, so it wasn't for us. It was for our son David. He had a little snafu with his taxes, so we went up there. And as we were waiting in line to get in, there's the guy with the metal detector thing, so you didn't bring any weapons into it. And Jan and I both had little knives on our keychain, right? So I thought, oh, no, we can't bring these knives in there. So while we were waiting in line, we took off our knives, and I put them in the flower bed outside the IRS office and thought, hey, you know what? We'll go in, we'll do our stuff, get it all straightened out. We come out, we'll grab our knives, and we'll leave. Well, we came out, and it had completely left me. It was totally gone. This is like a knife that I'd had for many, many years. So I got home, and I pulled out my keys, and I was looking at my keys. I said, there's something wrong with my keys right now. And I realized that we had left the knives there. So we went there a couple days later to see if they were still there, and they weren't. So it's like, have you ever had that where you committed in your mind that you were going to remember something, right? Have you ever done this? You go into Fresh and Easy, or you go into Lowe's, and you know that you were going in there for this one thing that you need to get. And then when you go in there, you start wandering the aisles because you think somehow it will jog your memory by just being there what you had to remember. Or maybe you were talking to somebody and you were in the middle of a conversation, and while you're listening and talking, you're thinking to yourself, there's something that I had to say, there's something that I wanted to talk about to them about, and now it's completely gone. And then the next night you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking, oh, that was it. That was what I had to say. That was what I had to talk about. Well, we play this memory game at home where you have the cards and you turn the cards over, and then you turn one card, you have to turn the other card over. You guys play that at all? Now that I'm 50, I think more about my memory, right? Trying to get my memory in shape so that I remember things. To practice memorizing things, remembering things. Now this morning, I want to encourage you to forget something. Okay, the opposite of it's natural for us most of the time to forget things, to forget where our keys are or what we're going to talk to somebody about or where our knife was. But this morning, I want to encourage you to forget something. Not pocket knives, not what you were going to buy in the store, not the question that you were going to ask something. I want to encourage you to forget yourself. To forget yourself. To understand the truth, as we'll look in the passage this morning about when we understand that what Jesus Christ, what God wants us to do in our spiritual lives is more and more forget ourselves. The more that we forget ourselves, the more that we will be enraptured with Jesus Christ. This morning, we're looking in Matthew chapter 6. As I said, if you turn there, there's an amazing transformation that takes place in our lives when we come to the place of acknowledging Jesus Christ. I mean, it's a paradigm shift when we begin to move away from ourselves and thinking about ourselves to understand that there is this great big God out there that loves us, that died for us, and to begin to realize that my attention needs to be not on myself and what I'm going through and what I'm experiencing, but on God as the one that He created me, and He loves me, and He has a purpose for me. We see the amazing grace on the cross, and we see how much Jesus Christ has done for us and how much He has freed us. That's why we sing the songs like these, because when we sing these songs, and we sing songs that are not as much oriented about ourselves and what I am as a Christian, but more worship songs, we try to pick songs that are oriented towards God and who He is, that we will fill our mind with who God is, and we'll lose sight of ourselves. Not only that, but as His children, that we now have the ability to know Him, to enjoy Him. That's what Paul talks about in Philippians 3. Paul's desire was to know Him. In fact, in Philippians 3, you see, he gives his testimony in a sense where Paul says that he was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as the law of Pharisees. That is that he had all this mentality in his life that he was looking at who he is and how much he had done and what his position was. But then he says later on, he says, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ. That is what Paul said, that he came to a place in his mind, not where he was putting himself down, but that he realized that as a child of God, that there was somebody much more wonderful that he could focus his attention on. And as he did, the problems in his life began to work themselves out. I mean, why would you want to know anyone else if you could know the God of all creation? Why would you not want to spend time with that person and focus your attention on that person and we know that he exists? And not only that, but if we know that God created us and he loves us and we were created for him to love and adore him, right? The two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So our attention is supposed to be away from ourselves to the God that's created us. Why would we ever then want to draw attention to ourselves in the things that we do as Christians? Why would we ever come to a place in our lives, and if we want to admit with ourselves, where we think about ourselves and we want to garner at least some of the attention for the things that we do? Why would I want to be gazed at as a child of God when I can point people to the person who is worthy of being gazed at and loved so much more than me? Why would I encourage or tolerate attention or the esteem of others when there is one so much greater than I am? And this is what we come to in Matthew 6. Jesus brought the first century believers to an understanding of what it means to renovate their hearts, of changing their hearts, of understanding what it means to be a follower of Christ. That he emphasized the fact that we are not to focus on the outward appearance, because when we focus on the outward appearance, it's all about us and what we're doing and what we're like and what people think of us. The issue is the heart. We, as followers of Christ, have to get to a place where we know and understand that what God wants to do is change our heart, and out of that change of heart will flow the issues of life, will flow the things that we do. That's why he started in Matthew 5 with the Beatitudes, describing the heart of someone in the kingdom of God. These heart issues are essential for us being salt and light in the earth and living a righteous life that glorifies our Father in heaven, verse 16. This heart was to be guided by the moral law we looked at in the Old Testament, not to abolish that, but to actually fulfill it as Jesus Christ changes our heart and helps us to live the life that honors him. Therefore, we looked at issues like murder of the heart and realized that it was wrong, that adultery of the heart was wrong. We look at these Pharisees, the religious leaders that try to make it palatable and easy so that they would look good to other people rather than trying to actually do what God wanted them to do. And now we'll see in this chapter how these Pharisees and scribes, because their heart was wrong in chapter 5, they had a tendency of focusing on themselves and trying to get other people to focus on them and who they were. They were into promoting themselves. So I want to read for you Matthew chapter 6, just verses 1 to 4. And I would encourage you in the weeks to come, because this morning we're looking at giving. Next Sunday we're looking at praying. And the next Sunday after that is the area of fasting. These three areas that these hypocrites, Jesus calls them, focused on how they were approached, how they were looked at by other people, rather than by what God wanted them to do. So Matthew 6, 1 to 4. He says, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. In this section, as I said, we see three areas of religious life that the Pharisees and really were emphasized throughout this time and really even to today. almsgiving or giving to the poor, prayer and fasting, or the three chief acts that the Jews looked at that were part of what it meant to be religious. That is how you treat those in need, how you treat God, and how you deal with yourself. But the question is, where is your heart? What is the motive? Why is it that we do the things that we do? What are we focused on? Now, I want you to look in sections, in chapter 6, section 1, verses 1 to 18. I just want to point out the attention that Jesus gives to the motives and the focus on self. Verse 1, he says there, in order to be seen by them. Verse 2, that they may be praised by others. Verse 16, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. And they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. These religious leaders, the Pharisees and the scribes, were focused on what others thought and tried to impress other people. They were forgetting that this great God had created them, that all of their attention and all of other people's attention that would tend to look at them should be pointed to the God that created them. And sadly, their eyes were turned on themselves only. So the first question in your outline is why do you do what you do? I want to spend some time on this before we get into the issue of giving, because this thread goes throughout this whole section. Why do you do the things that you do? Have you ever thought about that? Why is it that I do the things that I do? Now, in verse 1, Jesus starts out this section with a warning. Verse 1 is kind of like a summary, in a sense, of this whole section. He says, be careful, take hold of, pay attention, be on the guard of the danger of something. You and I have to be careful that our heart does not forget our God and begin to focus on ourselves. In our Christian life, you can easily slide into a place where, rather than looking at God and how great He is, that we begin to look at ourselves and how great we are, or we try to encourage other people to look at us and to be impressed. Some years ago, I told this story before, where I was walking one day on a sidewalk and there was a hole there, and I stepped in it, turned my ankle, and broke my ankle. Now, the problem was that I wasn't watching, I wasn't paying attention to where I was going, and because I wasn't careful, I stepped somewhere where I shouldn't have, and there was great damage. And I believe that as followers of Christ, that we can do exactly the same thing, that we can come to a place of knowing that this great God has saved us, and yet come to a place in time where we're not watching, we're stepping in our spiritual life, and our attention turns away from where we should be looking, which is, instead of to the hole, it should be to God, and we begin to look at other things, and we fall into a trap. We begin to ask the question, what will others think? How will this look to other people? Will I fit in, or will I be accepted? Why do you do the things that you do? Let me ask you if you fall into one of these three traps. The first point in your outline is their pride. We can be motivated by a desire to elevate ourselves, to promote ourselves. This is where the Pharisees were. They were all about the way that they appeared because they wanted the attention, the recognition, to be praised by others, to be honored by others. They lived and thrived on being the center of attention. Let me ask you a question. Do you live and thrive by being the center of attention in other people's lives? When they sounded their trumpet, as we read, when they were seen by others as spiritual, we can fail to see that no matter what anybody else says or what anybody else thinks about us, that pride is a voracious, aggressive master in our lives. That if we allow our focus on ourselves and elevating ourselves to captivate our heart, we will lose our spiritual focus and become ineffective as salt and light. And that's exactly where the Pharisees were. The second area is affirmation. Do you do things to be affirmed by others? Now, I'm not saying that we should not be encouraged by others, and we can be encouraged by the way that we do things and to be recognized by others at times. But do you live for it? Are you motivated? Is that why you do the things that you do? Because you need a pat on the back. Here you have the Pharisees so focused on what other people thought, and working hard to get that pat on their back in their religion, that they prayed a certain way, that they gave a certain way. They did all these things because they needed the affirmation of others. The problem with seeking your value from others is that no one is completely objective, and everybody has a jaded view of what you should do and what they should be doing. Nobody is completely objective except for God. God is the only one who is completely objective. He knows all about you, all your frailties, all your weaknesses, and He still loves you. God is the one where we ultimately find our worth, right? We sing these songs, and can it be? And what that should be is build us up in our value because we know that in Jesus Christ we have great worth because He loves us. But if you look in your neighbors and at work and in people you know to be constantly affirmed and encouraged by them, and if you don't have that affirmation, them speaking into your life constantly, that you find yourself down in the depths of depression. Lecrae's, a Christian recording artist, said, "If you live for people's acceptance, you will die from their rejection." How much are you controlled by what other people think? Do they control what you do and how you live your life rather than living your life for Jesus Christ? We need to find our value in our relationship with Jesus Christ, not in what other people think of us. Why do we do the things that we do? The third suggestion is that because we do it because of illusion. By that, I mean that the Pharisees had some major heart problems. If you go on in the Gospels, you see Jesus confronting the Pharisees for the way that they lived, where their heart was. He says that they were whitewashed tombs, hypocrites, blind leading the blind. But here in Matthew 6, we see these Pharisees performing seemingly very religious activities, giving and praying and fasting as a cover for where their hearts actually were. They were doing these things to set up this illusion of spirituality. In a sense, it was a dishonesty to all the people. So let me ask you again, why do you do the things that you do? Do you do the things you do to set up an illusion, a mirage, to be a hypocrite so that other people around you will just think, you know what, he's got it all together. He's praying and he's fasting and he's doing these things. Where really, honestly, in your heart, you know that there are some heart issues that you have to deal with. The problem with all these reasons is that they are self-focused. The issue is motive. God knows your heart. He knows why you do the things you do. Think about it. Why do you do the things that you do? As you go through this week at work or at home, whatever you do, stop and ask yourself the question, honestly, why am I doing these things? When you think about how you sing and how your voice sounds, right? Do you think about worshiping God, or do you think about the person next to you and what they think of your voice? Are people impressed because you can hit those high notes? Or do you think about how bad your voice is, right? That's equally bad because you're still focused on yourself rather than the God that you are to be worshiping. You ever think about the way that you pray and the way that it sounds to other people? Whether you sound spiritual enough and impress them? Do you come to church because you want to be in corporate fellowship and to learn and to encourage other people? Or do you come to church because you're afraid of what other people will think if you're not there? Or the way that you dress, or the way that you say things? Why do you serve? You do it to impress somebody else or to prove somebody else that you can do something? Or do you not say no because you're afraid of what they will think about you? Is your focus on serving and knowing Christ and making Him known, or impressing others? Finding your worth in what other people think that are fallen people that are jaded in their view? Or are you focused on creating an illusion from where your spiritual life, what your spiritual life really is? See, this concept is the concept of men pleasing. This is what the Pharisees did. They were thinking about the way they did things. How does it appear? I need to be able to please not God, but all these other people so that they're impressed with me. In John chapter 12, verse 43, we see that again. Jesus says there, nevertheless, many even of the authorities believed in Him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they love the glory that comes from men more than the glory that comes from God. They were more focused on what other people thought, the way that they appeared to other people. They were preoccupied with what others thought rather than what God thought. You need to be careful as a follower of God. You can be so preoccupied with the approval of men that you forget about the fact that we are here to please and be approved by God. I love this book. I've shared it before. It's in your outline. I love the title of it. What do you think of me, and why do I care? This is one of the things that maybe you'll decide if you struggle in this area that you'll get this book. It's a very biblical, theological book that looks at the idea that we are so enamored, we are so captivated by what other people think with us, and we have to ask the question, why do I care what you think of me, right? I need to only please Jesus Christ. And it's an either-or thing. Here you see Jesus saying that if you want the praise of men for the way that you pray, the way that you give, the way that you fast, or anything, then that is all that you will get. That's what he's saying here. It's either one or the other. If I'm up here preaching just for your approval and to get a pat on the back afterward, I will receive what Jesus says here, no reward in heaven for it. Because it's a matter of the motive. Now notice what it says in verse 1. He says, to beware of practicing your righteousness before others to be seen by them. This is the idea of being noticed. When we concentrate so much on impressing others, we tend to be performing for them. Ever perform for somebody? It is a Greek word which has the idea of the theater. It suggests the idea of being on stage and performing before other people. Becoming a spectacle to be gazed at, to be looked on. It has the idea of performing as an actor, a sham. Look in verses 2, 5, and 16. In each of these three areas that Jesus talks about, he uses the word hypocrite. He uses the word hypocrite. That was a Greek actor who wore a mask that portrayed an exaggerated role of someone else. It was someone who pretended to be somebody that they were not. One example of this is in Matthew chapter 9, where Jesus came up to those that were mourning, and they were professional mourners, and he sent them out. These are people that were paid to act in a way of mourning. They would tear their clothes. Tearing was a sign of grief, and so when they tear their clothes, they would tear them right along the seam so that they could sew them back up on the seam, and they could use them again at the next time that they were to mourn. There was a sense of insincerity that it was manufactured. And my question for you is, do you do that with other people at times in your Christianity? Do you do that? The Apostle Paul was the exact opposite of this acting, this concept of pleasing men. He didn't play the part with anybody. He didn't act. It wasn't a sham. He was always who he was. He was not concerned about what other people thought ultimately. In Galatians 1:10, he says, therefore, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Jesus Christ. 1 Thessalonians 2:4, Paul there writes, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts. We have to come to a place in our Christianity where we ask ourselves the question, why am I really doing this? We need to live by forgetting what other people think. You know, really, when we're preoccupied with what other people think, we're really preoccupied with ourselves and the way that we come across. When other people think good of us, our emotions can be very high. We feel affirmed and approved. But when somebody makes a comment or says something, then we can be down in the dumps. We need to guard our hearts and live for Christ's approval and reward. That will never change. It will never vary. It is the only one true thing that we can trust in. Augustine said, the love of honor is the deadly bane of true piety. Other vices bring forth evil works, but this brings forth good works in an evil way. You understand that? when we do things that are good, but we do them for the wrong motive, it is evil. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 4, he says, But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or any human court. In his ministry, in his life, Paul looked at God's approval, not the approval of man. Verse 4 in that same chapter, he says, It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore do not pronounce judgment before the Lord comes, who will bring to light now the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purpose of the heart. And each one will receive his commendation from the Lord. Note that what Paul says, it's not just what you do, but it's the motive of the heart that matters. So why do you do the things you do? Now, it's interesting because there's parts and passages in Scripture where it seems like, and I want to address this, that people are worried about what other people think. For example, in Matthew chapter 17, Matthew 17, verses 24 to 27. Are there times where people seem to be effective or motivated by what other people think and to do things? And I want to address this. Matthew 17, 24 to 27. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, Does your teacher not pay the tax? And he said, Yes. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, What do you think, Simon? For whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others? And when he said from others, Jesus said, Then the sons are free. So, in a sense, what he's saying is that he and his followers should not have to pay taxes. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. So what is Jesus doing here? He's saying he's not concerned about the Pharisees or anybody, right? He's saying we don't have to pay taxes, but not to cause an offense, not to cause the attention to be drawn away from God and His kingdom and onto us because we're not paying taxes. I want you to go, I want you to find the first fish, and I want you to pay the tax. It's not a matter of Jesus saying, you know what, I'm worried about what others think, I'm trying to please everybody. What He's saying is that I don't want to take the attention away from God and His kingdom onto us because we don't pay the tax. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul there wrote, For we aim at what is honorable not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of men. Paul's saying there, he had talked before about not being a man-pleaser, and yet he's saying, I also need to think about how we're looked at in the sight of man, not to please them, but not to cause an offense and not to cause a stumbling block for the gospel. While Paul was living to please Christ, he also wanted to be honorable in sight of the men for the point of ministry. In fact, in Acts chapter 16, verse 3, as Paul went to various areas, it says, Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Wow, can you imagine that? Why did Paul do that? Did Paul do that and call Timothy, you need to go get circumcised because he was afraid of the people that were going to? No, he did it because he knew that that would be a stumbling block for the gospel and what he was trying to do in the ministry. See, what Paul was doing is the same thing that Jesus is saying, is that all the attention needs to be not on myself, but on Jesus Christ and what God has done. So that when I'm doing something religious, that I'm not doing it motive for attention. And when I don't do something, or the way that I live my life, I don't want people to look at me and draw attention to me because I'm not circumcised or because I'm not paying the tax or things like that. I want to take everything out of the way so that as I live my life will be point to Jesus Christ. In these examples, Jesus and Paul weren't living to please anybody, but they knew that the way they lived impacted others and influenced others. You shouldn't live for the attention and the approval of others, but you don't want yourself to be a distraction from the gospel and the ministry. So the question is, how do I move, as Jesus is saying here, how do I move from an other self-focus to a God focus? This is what Jesus is saying. He's saying in verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. He says, I want you to be careful about this because you can easily fall into this trap. First, get a big picture of God. How in my mind you'll get to a point where I'm not going into the temple and thinking, you know what? I'm going to sound the trumpet. When I'm fasting, I'm going to look like I'm fasting. Whatever I do, what is my motive for doing it? The first thing is to get the big picture of God. If you immerse yourself in the greatness of God, if you realize how great God is, you will never have a desire to draw attention to yourself. Do you understand that? The reason that we have a tendency of asking ourselves, what do people think, and focusing on us, like the Pharisees did, is because we have a low view of God, and we need to elevate our view of God. If we had a true view of God, we would see it as a sanity to think about what other people think about us, right? And to draw attention to ourselves. When we read our Bible, we should read it mostly to get to know Him and to see how great it is, not just to think about, how does this apply to me and what are the principles that I need to learn? We can learn that. That's true. There are commands that we are to obey in the Scriptures. But more than that, this book is about Him and giving us a big view of God so that our life is influenced by that. We can study the Bible in a man-centered way rather than a God-centered preoccupation. We should realize that the universe does not revolve around us, but it revolves around God. And our view of Scripture and our lives should revolve around this great God who has created everything. And that will allow us to move from a focus of self to a focus of God. When you are enamored with God, when you see how great He is, you will think less of yourself. It's like John the Baptist says, He must decrease and I must increase, right? No, John the Baptist didn't say that, right? He said, He must increase and I must decrease. John the Baptist saw that. He said, the more that I elevate and I see how great God is, the more that I will decrease, the more that I will become less important, the less that I will think about myself and talk about myself and encourage other people to look at me. The second point there is to get off the stage. Think about this. How much do you think about yourself during the day? The things that you're going through, the things that you think, the way people think about you, the goals of your life. How much do you think about that? This is a rhetorical question. What percentage of your day do you spend thinking about yourself and your life? And what percentage of the day do you spend thinking about Jesus Christ and God and the cross and those things? That's a telling question, isn't it? How preoccupied, how much are you on your own stage as a center of the attention in your own thinking and also in your talking? When you're talking to your wife, to your husband, to other people, how much do you talk about yourself and what you're thinking and what you're going through and what you want to do and where you've been and what all that stuff? And how much do you talk about Jesus Christ? And how much do you talk about God? What you talk about indicates what is really important to you, right? We are to put Christ on display and have it all be about Him. Am I saying that we should never talk about ourselves? Obviously not. But you've got to look at those percentages and ask yourself the question, predominantly, where is the focus of my life? Am I on the stage or is Jesus Christ on the stage? For the Pharisees, they were on the stage. Clearly in this passage, they were the ones that wanted to be on stage. They wanted to get the attention. How do I move away from others to self? I would suggest read that book. What do you think of me? Why do I care? Right? And that last point there is to die to self. This is the foundation of what it means to be a follower of Christ, a letting go of self, and realizing this life is no longer about me and what I want. Things are going to happen in my life that I don't want. Things will be difficult at times, but even with those struggles, my question is it still about me and what I'm going through? Is my prayer life and my talk to other people, when I talk to them, mostly about me and what I'm going through, or is it about God and His greatness? Because if it's about me, I haven't died to self to the extent that I need to. And the happiest place that we can be as a Christian is what Jesus said when He said that we have to die to self. Jesus lays the foundation for our motivation for all that we do as Christians. And then now we get to verses 2 to 4, approaches the first of three religious activities, giving. Why should you give? Why should you give? This is where the focus of self comes in clarity, because he says they would go out. He says, don't sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, that they may be praised by others. They have received their reward they have received the reward. It's unclear whether they were actually sounding a trumpet or what that means. One of the commentators said that when they gave, that there was actually something that looked like a trumpet, that when you throw your coins into it, that everybody would be able to hear the coins go into it and it would draw attention to yourself. Can you imagine that when you give, that you don't have a check or something, but I got this big bag of money, and now the offering pouch is coming around, and I'm going to take this big bag for everybody to see, and I'm going to plunk it in there, right? That's what Jesus Christ is talking about here. The practice of giving is one of the essential practices of a follower of Christ. Not only in the law, you look at Genesis 28, where Jacob, before the law, gave a tenth to the Lord. It was true in the law of Moses. But we have to ask ourselves, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why do I give? Why do you give? What is it that causes you to give? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, as Christians, we know that we're supposed to. Let me give you some suggestions. First of all, giving is part of worship. Giving is part of worship. When we give, when they were going into the temple, the point of that was not just to give to the poor, but it was part of the worship. It was in the temple. I love in Matthew chapter 2 when the wise men went before the baby Jesus. And it says, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary and his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This idea of we coming before the Lord, we see how great God is, and it's natural for us as part of our worship. Part of what we do is our thankfulness to him for how good he is. It's a response to him for his faithfulness to us. Secondly, we should give because we're good stewards. We are to be good stewards. 1 Corinthians 4:2, Paul there says it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. So God has given to you and to me all this money, all these resources. That's really God's, right? I mean, we have to admit that. And I'm going to talk about giving this summer when I look at the covenant of fellowship and the different aspects of it. But if we understand that all this money is God's and we have a chance to give part of it back to God as worship to him in whatever form that it is, and if we realize that we're stewards because it's God's, it's really God's money and he can direct us where we are to give it. Therefore, when we are in relationship with somebody else and we know that they have a need, that a financial need, that we don't ask ourselves the question, what do I want to do with my money? But we ask God the question, God, what do you want me to do with your money? And as a steward, God may say sometimes, you know what, there's a family in need and you need to respond to that need. And part of it's worship because you realize how great God is, but part of it is a sense of stewardship in my life to understand that these are resources that God has given to me. And that's why we give. The third area is we should give because others have needs. This is what primarily Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about those that are in need. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul there talks about taking up a collection for the church in Jerusalem. Paul encouraged the churches to see there's this group of people that are in need and you have the resources. And 1 Corinthians, he talks quite a lot about that. And so he challenges them to give to the need because there are others that are destitute. This is what it says in Leviticus 25:35-38. This is in the law. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Do we do this that much in church? When's the last time? I'm not asking for an answer. This is again rhetorical. When's the last time you saw somebody else in need? Maybe it was somebody at work, somebody in the church, and you knew there was a financial need, and you say, you know what, God, out of worship to you, this is stewardship to you, I'm going to respond to this need. It says, take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God. Galatians 2:10, Paul says the same thing. When they were in Jerusalem, they had the affirmation of the elders, and the elders said to them, now, one thing we want you to do with this gospel ministry is not forget the poor. And that's what he says in Galatians 2:10. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. See, what Paul and those apostles saw was that their finances were part of their ministry of the gospel to other people. So in closing, let me give you some principles that are important in giving, specifically in these verses. We need to see giving as your responsibility. Our responsibility as children of God. Jesus said, when you give, verse 2 and verse 3, not if, but when. God calls us to give to needs around us. Part of that's done through the church and the benevolence fund and the way that we are able to support missionaries. Part of that is you in your relationships, as I said, when there's people around you that have a need, and God lays it on your heart to say, you know what, I want you to respond to this need and care for them. The second thing that we need to do is to be discerning. We need to be discerning. Verse 3, Jesus says to the needy, it assumes there is an actual need. Then, as with now, there are professional beggars. We see them sometimes. People that try to work the system that don't have a legitimate need. There are those that could provide for themselves but choose not to provide for themselves. There are those that would take those gifts and that support and use it to destroy themselves through things like drugs and alcohol. And though that is the case sometimes today, we have to guard ourselves from assuming that every person that is needy falls into one of these categories. Therefore, we must be discerning in whom we give, but we are called to give. When as elders we have somebody that we know or somebody that calls the church and has a need, a financial need, we try to be very discerning. We want to help people, but we meet with the person. We find out what their situation is. Not only that, but what their spiritual needs are. Because we want to give and we want to support those that are truly in need. And the same thing you need to do on a personal level. You need to care for those that have needs, but also to be discerning. Third, we need to understand that our giving needs to be to others should be done confidentially. Anonymously, if possible. Jesus said in verse 3, they should not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing so that your giving is in secret. The phrase suggests this idea of a limited knowledge or understanding even between two hands. The problem with a person when they know that somebody has given them something is that they tend to turn their attention away from God onto the person who gave the gift. That's exactly what Jesus is speaking against right here. That's why we have an offering pouch here, that it's very indiscreet as you give. And when we've had situations in our church that I've had the privilege of being part of, when I have somebody come to me and I say, you know, there's this family that's in need and we want to give a gift to them, but we don't want them to know that it's us. And I have the joy to relay in that gift. And they always say, is it you? And I say, no, it's not me. It is not me. But there's a beauty in that because there's a love in the body of Christ that also should be outside the body of Christ, but there's also a confidentiality. Charles Spurgeon said that we should keep the thing so secret that even you yourself are hardly aware that you were doing anything at all praiseworthy. Let God be present and you will have enough of an audience. When we forget ourselves as children of God, and we think about our spiritual lives and all that we do, all the things that we do, all the things that we could perform, and begin to ask ourselves the question, why am I doing these things? And as we still go through this passage to look at these Pharisees and say, this is the wrong way, do I have that in my heart? Do I have that tendency to focus on myself? When you forget about yourself, you will be the happiest and most fulfilled. We should be consumed by a love for others in need, both materially and spiritually, that we have no care for ourselves. This is that last point. Why do we give? We help others. Helping others must include the gospel. We have an opportunity as children of God in the body and outside to minister to people's needs. Not for our own attention, Not for our own glory, but for God's glory and for the sake of the gospel. Let's pray. Father, I pray, God. I pray that we be so enamored with you, God. So in love with you that we would have such a great view, an excitement of you that, like Paul said in Philippians, that our whole desire would be to know you and to make you known to others, God. And that we would get out of the way. Father, it's not that we would put ourselves down or put other people down. It's that we would just completely forget about ourselves because our eyes are on you, God. You are the great God that loves us. And Father, may everything that we do point to you. We ask in Jesus' name.